You ever feel like no one really gets you? Not in a dramatic way, just in a quiet, constant way that's been there as long as you can remember. Like, people hear what you say but miss what you mean. They see what you do but don't understand why. They think they know you, but they're responding to a version of you that doesn't actually exist. I'm not complicated. I'm just tired of explaining myself. Stay with me, because what you're feeling isn't imagined, and it didn't come from nowhere. I watched someone I care about live with this for decades. Every conversation felt like translation. Every relationship felt like performance. Not because they were being difficult, but because something about the way they experienced the world didn't match the way most people expected them to be. And once you see why this happens, the loneliness starts to make sense. If this already sounds uncomfortably familiar, you are definitely not alone. People probably think you're fine. Maybe even that you have it all together. They see someone who's capable, independent, gets things done. But they don't see how exhausting it is to constantly bridge the gap between who you are and who they think you are. And inside, you've been carrying this weight for so long, you barely remember what it feels like to be fully seen. You're not hard to understand. You're just operating on a wavelength most people aren't tuned into. And there's actual psychology behind why some people go their whole lives feeling fundamentally misunderstood. Why you've learned to keep parts of yourself hidden. Why you've stopped trying to explain because it never seems to land. If you've ever felt like you're speaking a language no one else speaks, like you're always having to translate yourself, like people keep getting you wrong no matter how clearly you communicate, this is for you. Because the way you experience the world isn't wrong. It's just different. And understanding why changes everything. So let's talk about what really happens when you've spent your whole life being misunderstood. Here's the thing most people don't get. You may not be overreacting. You're just feeling things at a depth most people don't reach. What registers as a minor annoyance to someone else hits you harder. What they shrug off lingers with you for days. What they experience as fine feels overwhelming to you. And when you try to explain that, people tell you you're being too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. So you learn to downplay it, to act like things don't affect you as deeply as they do, to keep your actual reactions to yourself because sharing them only makes people uncomfortable. Here's what that looks like in real life. You're not choosing to feel more. You just do. Your emotional range is wider. Your capacity for both joy and pain runs deeper. You notice subtleties in tone, mood, energy that other people miss entirely. And that's not a flaw. That's just how you're built. But when you live in a world that expects everyone to operate at the same emotional frequency, and yours is different, you start to feel like something's wrong with you. This is why you've learned to edit yourself. Why you say, "I'm fine," when you're not. Why you've stopped sharing how you really feel, because people's responses make you feel worse, not better. Research on sensory and emotional processing shows that some people are wired to process stimuli more deeply. They're not more fragile, just more receptive. And when that difference isn't acknowledged, it leads to chronic feelings of being misunderstood and unseen. Sound familiar? Before we go deeper, hit like if you've ever felt like people are talking to a version of you that doesn't exist. Here's the part that makes it worse. People have decided who you are, and no matter what you say or do, they keep responding to that version instead of the real you. Maybe they decided you're quiet, so they assume you have nothing to say. Maybe they decided you're confident, so they don't realize you're struggling. Maybe they decided you're fine on your own, so they don't think to check in. And when you try to show them something different, when you contradict their assumptions, they don't update their understanding. They just get confused. or they accuse you of changing. Here's why it feels so isolating. You're constantly aware of the gap between who you are and who people think you are. You watch them respond to the wrong version. You see them make assumptions that aren't true. You feel the disconnect every time they misread your intentions or misinterpret your actions. And you can't fix it, because the problem isn't what you're saying. It's what they're hearing, and you can't control what people choose to see. This is why you feel invisible, even when people are looking at you. Why you feel misunderstood, even in relationships where people claim to know you. You're not hard to read. They may be projecting their version of you instead of actually seeing you. This happens more often than people realize. There are people who spent their entire lives feeling misunderstood, even while the world was watching them. Emily Dickinson is one example. She wasn't distant because she didn't care. She withdrew because her inner world was deeper than most people knew how to meet. Her letters reveal someone intensely observant, emotionally rich, and deeply attuned, but constantly misread as cold, odd, or detached. She once wrote that she felt like she was standing alone in a crowd. Not because no one was there, but because no one was really seeing her. And that's the kind of misunderstanding that hurts the most. Because it doesn't look like rejection. It looks like being surrounded and still unseen. Let's be honest, your thoughts don't come out the way you mean them. You'll say something that makes perfect sense to you, and people look confused. You'll try to explain your reasoning, and they interrupt before you've finished. You'll share something important, and they latch onto the wrong part entirely. It's not that you're bad at communicating. It's that you're compressing too much into too little space. You think in connections, not linear steps. You consider context, nuance, multiple layers at once. You see the whole picture and then try to translate it into words. But by the time you do, people have already decided what you meant. Here's the part nobody tells you. Many people tend to think more linearly. Point A to point B. Simple cause and effect. Clear conclusions. But you think in webs. Everything connects to everything else. One thought branches into 5 more. You're considering exceptions, implications, alternative perspectives, all at the same time. And when you try to express that, it comes out sounding complicated, confusing, like you're overthinking. But you're not overthinking. You're just thinking in a way that doesn't compress neatly into the format most conversations expect. This is why you've learned to simplify, to give the shortened version, to skip all the context and nuance that actually matters to you, because including it makes people tune out. You're just exhausted from constantly translating complexity into simplicity so people can keep up. This next one is going to hit home. Here's something people don't realize. You've spent your whole life being misunderstood, not because of what you do, but because of why people think you're doing it. This isn't about what you say. It's about why people think you're saying it. You set a boundary, and they think you're being cold. You ask a question, and they think you're challenging them. You need space, and they think you're pulling away. You're not doing anything wrong, but people assign motives to your actions that don't match your actual intentions. Here's why this matters. You're operating with one set of values, priorities, and emotional logic, but people are judging you based on theirs. So when your actions don't make sense within their framework, they fill in the gaps with assumptions. And those assumptions are almost always wrong. This is why you feel defensive even when you haven't done anything wrong. Why you've learned that no matter how carefully you word things, someone will find a way to take it the wrong way. Here's the real question nobody stops to ask. How many times have you tried to explain yourself before you finally stopped? You used to try. You used to think that if you just found the right words, people would finally understand. So you explained, and clarified, and rephrased, and tried again. And it didn't work. Not because you weren't clear, but because people weren't actually listening to understand. So eventually, you stopped trying. Here's the cruel irony. You stopped explaining because being misunderstood silently hurt less than being misunderstood after trying your hardest to be clear. This is why you keep things to yourself now. Why you don't share what's really going on. Why you've built walls that aren't really walls. They're just protection from the exhaustion of explaining yourself to people who don't actually want to understand. You're not closed off. You're just tired. And that's not the same thing. The loneliest moment in someone's life is when they are watching their whole world fall apart, and all they can do is stare blankly. F. Scott Fitzgerald. But here's the truth. You're not lonely because you're broken. You're lonely because you've been explaining yourself to people who weren't listening. Here's what you need to hear. Being misunderstood your whole life doesn't mean you're complicated, difficult, or too much. It means you've been surrounded by people who weren't equipped to see you clearly, who responded to their version of you instead of the real one, who expected you to fit into their framework instead of meeting you where you actually are. And that's not your failure. That's theirs. You don't need to keep explaining. You don't need to keep translating yourself. You don't need to keep shrinking who you are, so people feel more comfortable with a version of you that isn't real. You need to find people who don't require a translation, who hear what you mean, not just what you say, who don't assign motives you don't have, who let you be complex without calling you complicated. Those people exist. They're rare, but they're out there. And they're probably just as tired of being misunderstood as you are. Not all at once. Not by lowering your standards or accepting shallow understanding, but gradually, one real connection at a time. You get to be yourself fully, without apology, without explanation. You get to stop performing clarity for people who aren't actually trying to understand. You get to be seen for who you are, not who people need you to be. And the people who are right for you, they won't make you explain. They'll just get it. Some people will hear this and say, "You're just not trying hard enough to be understood." That reaction tells you more about them than it does about you. Because you were never the problem. You were just in rooms full of people who weren't listening. And now you get to find the ones who are. You're not hard to understand. Most people just aren't listening the right way. And that creates a gap that feels insurmountable. But it's not permanent. So here's what psychology reveals. If you felt misunderstood your whole life, it's not because you're defective or difficult. It's because the way you experience and express the world doesn't match the narrow bandwidth most people operate on. And that's not a flaw. That's just a mismatch between who you are and who the world expected you to be. But you don't have to keep explaining. You don't have to keep translating. You don't have to keep proving that you're understandable. You get to find people who understand you without the work. You get to stop performing clarity. You get to be complex without being called complicated. And maybe the real question isn't why people don't understand you. It's whether you're ready to stop trying to make them and start finding the ones who already do. Drop a muted speaker emoji if you've spent your whole life being misunderstood and you're tired of explaining. And comment this. Do you think being misunderstood is more about how you communicate or about whether someone is actually listening?